Welcome back again to Kings of the North, Doug Lesmerises, Bill Landis, and today, Landis, Texas versus Washington, a full show breaking down that semifinal in the Sugar Bowl. We already did a breakdown of Michigan, Alabama in the Rose Bowl. If you did not find that in your Kings of the North podcast feed or on your Kings of the North YouTube channel, we would certainly direct you towards that. But, and that one, I thought that we did a really good breakdown, Landis, of a very even game in the Rose Bowl and like a lot of like an interesting matchup, a contrast of styles. And I don't feel that today. Washington is undefeated, is the 2 seed. Texas is the 3 seed. I'm not just saying this because it's the North. Washington's been the underdog since this game came out. Washington is currently a 4-point dog in this game against Texas. And when you look at the futures of like who's going to win the playoff on DraftKings, Michigan is plus 195, Alabama is plus 205, Texas is plus 260, and Washington is 7-1. Why is Washington 7-1 to win the national title? Why is Washington the big underdog of these 4 teams? Because I frankly don't get it.
It's odd to me. I mean, I guess it's a reflection of like Washington. Washington is undefeated, but I also think you could say that Washington's play throughout the season has been the most erratic of these 4 teams. Like they were so good out of the gate, and then really through the middle of the season, honestly, up until the Pac-12 championship game against Oregon, they were not playing very well and kind of winning despite that. Which I guess you could say is like an impressive trait of a team to not play your best football and still find ways to win. But I think it's probably being used against Washington at the moment as people try to assess what could happen in this playoff. But even if that were the case, and I'm not even saying that's necessarily unfair, the gap to me still feels very, very odd. Like I don't know why it's viewed as like 3 teams that have a reasonable chance of winning the national championship and a 4th in Washington. It's like, yeah, they're like the long shot to do this. It's weird because I think that Washington, if you like separate all the components of these teams and rank them in terms of like most impressive and most dangerous, the top of that list has to be the way that Washington throws the ball, in my opinion. So I don't know why they would be viewed as the team that has the longest odds of winning this thing.
If we were having a draft, right? Yeah, if we were drafting the 8 sides of the ball in the playoff, offense, defense for all 4 teams, Washington's offense is the number 1 pick.
I agree.
I'm gonna wind up getting mad. I don't think Oregon, if Oregon had beaten Washington and Oregon was in the playoff, I don't think Oregon would be viewed this way. Do you agree with that?
I think that's right. Yes.
All right. I'm going to ask you a series of yes and no, true and false questions now.
Okay.
All right. So here I have the schedules for both Texas and Washington. And this is we have to parse this a little bit. Is this Washington team the best team that Texas has played this season? And I ask that because we're saying the week 2 Alabama team that Texas beat.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about the Alabama right now. I'm talking about the collection of players and the coaches that were on the field against Texas this year.
Yeah, I think it is. Yes.
I think it is too, because Bama has come such a long way. The quarterback situation at Bama when they lost to Texas led to Jalen Milroe being benched. Mm-hmm. Guess what's not going to happen after this Texas-Washington game, no matter what? Michael Penix isn't getting benched, okay?
No.
Do you think this version of Texas, this Texas team, is the best team that Washington has played this year?
That's an interesting question. I mean, the fact that I even paused to think about it I think is noteworthy. No, I think I might take Oregon as a slightly better team than Texas, like total body of work for the season.
You love the Ducks. You thought the Ducks were going to be here. I've loved the Huskies. We were doing all the whole thing. People watching King of the North all season. Mm-hmm. Hey, about once Brian Ferentz got fired, we're like, well, we'll chuck the Brian Ferentz segment, and we're going to do our playoff predictions. I had Washington in there almost the whole time. You had Oregon in there almost the whole time. You love you some Ducks. I didn't love the Ducks as much, but I think Oregon is better than Texas. both sides of the ball, consistency at quarterback, depth of playmakers. I think Oregon is a better team, and you can't look at what Washington did against Oregon and call it two flukes. I mean, what are we? Well, the first time Washington beat Oregon, a lot of people thought that the better team lost that game. Dan Lanning went for some fourth downs. They didn't get it. Washington barely held on at the end. But Washington can't be 2-0 and be lucky to be in the playoff. I do think they've beaten twice a better overall team than they're facing in this game.
Well, everyone thought Washington was going to lose. They were a 9-point underdog against Oregon in the second game,
Yes.
and they played like significantly better the second time against Oregon. Like they kind of pushed Oregon around for a large chunk of that game. So the first one was a little wonky, I guess, and it's not that Washington played poorly and was lucky to win. But then the second time those two teams met, if there were questions about that first game, I thought Washington answered almost all of them with the way that they played that game and sort of asserted themselves. So, yeah, it's not a fluke at all in my mind that Washington won both of those games or even won the first game. So I actually do think Texas and Oregon are like somewhat similar. And there are probably like certain components of Texas that are better than Oregon's, like namely the defensive line and maybe the offensive line. At least it's close. But I think they're similar styles of team. At the very least, I think they're kind of like even in terms of like how they go about their business and kind of the success that they had this year. So why Washington is viewed as an underdog and such a long shot in this game, given the fact that we've like seen them play a team that is similar to this and beat them twice is a little odd to me.
All right, two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
You brought up the inconsistency of Washington this year. And that, again, Michael Penix came out in the non-conference, was threw for 400 yards in each of the three non-conference games, went crazy. And then they did have a crazy dip, including almost losing to Arizona State, which is not a good team. And Washington didn't score an offensive touchdown in that game. And I understand taking that into account. I understand making that part of the evaluation. But I think Washington's back. I don't think this is the almost lost to Arizona State Washington anymore. And I think a huge part of that is the return of Jalen McMillan.
Absolutely.
A year ago, both Odunze and Jalen McMillan were 1,000-yard receivers. Jalen McMillan played the first three games, then was gone, was hurt the whole year. He came back in the Apple Cup, was kind of himself, and then he was back. He was himself again, over 100 yards against Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game. So when you say to yourself, oh, well, what happened to the Washington offense? Well, their 1,000-yard receiver was hurt, and now he's back. And by the way, while he was out, Jalen Polk became a 1,000-yard receiver. So right now, this team is going to put three guys on the field who have all had 1,000 receiving yards in the college football season. I think that is, like, I almost am throwing out how they looked against Arizona State, how they looked against Oregon State, how they looked when they did bog down sometimes, because I think Jalen McMillan in the slot is that important to what Washington does.
I think that's right. I also think that Michael Penix was, I think, clearly not himself. And I don't know that anything was really revealed about what that could have looked like. But it looked like to me that he got kind of injured something in that first Oregon game and then just kind of wasn't the same from then. Maybe he played a little bit better toward the end of the year than he was kind of in the middle, but just not as consistent, I think, as he was earlier on. And obviously, caliber of opponent might factor into that. But I think we know that Michael Penix is a good player and didn't look 100%. And I also think they probably got a little too pass happy, like in the middle of the season. And I think some of the struggles that they did have mid-season have actually led them to a better place offensively. They found a little more balance within their offense and have become a more effective and efficient rushing team over the course of that. And then they kind of put it all together against Oregon in the Pac-12 championship. It wasn't like quite passing fireworks all the time, but they ran it really well. And certainly they threw it down the field well enough to win that game. And I think kind of figuring out who they need to be and now having this time off to rest and recover, I think the break probably benefits Washington more than it does any other team in the playoff.
All right, last comparison, last question I want to ask. I have a very specific comparison for this Texas team. Another team that made the college football playoff that I think Texas reminds me of. Do you want to guess who I think Texas reminds me of?
I don't know. One of the Ohio State teams.
TCU last year, and everyone thought TCU stunk. What is the difference between Max Duggan at quarterback and Quinn Ewers at quarterback? What's the difference between Quentin Johnston at receiver and Xavier Worthy at receiver? What's the difference between Kendre Miller at running back and Jonathan Brooks at running back? What Texas has been during the course of this year where they've been good, and their defense is better. Their defense is better. But they have been escaping by the skin of their teeth repeatedly. They were 10-10 entering the fourth quarter with Wyoming in week 3 after beating Alabama. They trailed Oklahoma, lost that game, trailed Oklahoma going in the fourth quarter, lose that game. They're only up 3 on Houston going into the fourth quarter before winning that game. They blow a 13-point lead and go into overtime to beat Kansas State. They blow a 20-point lead going into the fourth quarter, almost blow it, against TCU. They win by 3 against TCU, and they're up by a score against Iowa State going into the fourth quarter. I've been waiting for this team to lose all year. I can't believe they made it. We were waiting for TCU to lose all last year, and somehow they made it. They are in the playoff because they beat a facsimile of Alabama in week 2, not what Alabama would become. They got credit for beating end of the year Alabama when they beat baby. They beat toddler Bama. Now, Bama's a man now. Bama has hair in its armpits. They beat toddler Alabama. But when people look at Texas, they're like, whoa, you've seen Bama. That's a man. Hey, if I fought Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, but I fought him when he was 3, and I'd be like, oh, did I tell you a story about the time I beat up Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson? Be like, wow, what happened? I'd be like, well, he was in nursery school. People wouldn't be like, well, it doesn't matter. You still beat him up. So, like, that's what Texas is. What are we doing? How have we reached the point where Texas is a monster? They're not a monster. I'm not saying, like, I'm talking about the perception of Texas, and I'm not even arguing that they shouldn't be in the playoff, but I'm talking about why they're favored over Washington, why they're viewed as having an equal chance at winning the national title with Bama and Michigan far ahead of Washington. I feel like this has been a lucky team. I feel like this has been a team propped up by that Alabama win, which to me was much more about Alabama being bad than Texas being good. I don't think this conference is good. Everyone's talking about the Big 12's having a great bowl season. You know who the Big 12's? They're 5-2 right now. You know who they've beaten in bowl season? Cal, UNLV, Texas A&M, North Carolina without Drake May, and NC State. Those are the 5 Big 12 bowl wins. And they lost to Georgia Tech and Arizona. So, like, what about? Meanwhile, I think the Pac-12 was actually good. I think the Pac-12 was far superior to the Big 12 this year. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just upset at the perception because I think it's wrong on both sides. I think people don't realize how good Washington is, and they think Texas is actually better than Texas really is.
Well, Texas too had the lopsided win in the Big 12 championship, right? Like I think people have wanted to see Texas like kick it into that gear all season. Then it finally happened in conference championship weekend. And now they're kind of just bathing in that momentum a little bit. And people, I don't know, like people want Texas to be good, right? Like people think college football is better when Texas is part of the national championship picture, which I don't think I agree with. I don't care if Texas stinks or not. So, but I think that's what it is. I don't know. It's weird. Like nationally, I think people have been like hesitant for whatever reason to like wrap their arms around this Washington team. And I don't know why. I don't know why that's the case, and I don't know why Texas has suddenly become some kind of darling because it managed to win a couple of close games in a like average Power 5 league. I'm with you on the perception. It's weird. It does feel off to me. Like there are definitely things to like about Texas. Like I actually would push back a little bit on the comparison to TCU. Like I think that Texas has far more dudes than that TCU team that made the playoff last year had. But it's also like not going into the playoff as a world beater. Like I'm supposed to think that they're that because they put it on Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship game. Like that's too far of a leap for me.
Okay, we're going to take a break before we get into the breakdowns because I had so many things I was mad about that I have to reset myself. I think you're right about people being late. I don't know why. I have one more thing to say. I also think in this playoff, I think it's a really good matchup for Washington overall. That I think the thing that that Washington would worry me for Washington is almost like what Oregon was, like a team that can throw the ball as well as Washington, but has a better defense, right? But I think the Washington aerial assault, if they can score some points and force Quinn Ewers in Texas or JJ McCarthy in Michigan or Jalen Milroe in Alabama to like try to keep up with them, I think a lot of the matchups, I think it's a good group for Washington. You know that, and I don't know. I mean, you mentioned on the Rose Bowl preview that Alabama might have the two best corners in the country. So if we get Alabama Washington, that's going to be on, right? That's real. And I actually think Michigan's secondary is very good too. But like it's not like Washington and Michael Penix are going in there to face Trevor Lawrence and Clemson. They're not going in there to face Bryce Young in Alabama. They're not going in there to face like another quarterback on the level of Michael Penix. So I just think there's a lot of favorable things for Washington in this playoff that clearly is not reflected in the betting lines.
No, yeah, it's not like when I was like trying to figure out, I think I've said this before, when we were like trying to figure out like what these matchups could look like heading into the playoff, this game was one that I had in my mind and one that I like felt pretty good about if I'm Washington because of its strengths compared to Texas's weaknesses. But I also think, like to your point, it's maybe true of the playoff field in general. Like Washington has flaws. We're going to talk about them. We're not sitting here to tell you that Washington's a complete and perfect team, but it's about who can exploit their advantages the best. And Washington seems to have the thing that really none of these other teams have with Michael Penix and those receivers and their ability to just kind of bomb it on teams. So again, it's weird. Like I just don't understand it. Maybe our vision is clouded by being proponents of Northern football teams, and we like Washington so much. But the perception of Washington as the underdog in this playoff foursome is very odd to me.
No. The North does not bring cloudiness. The North brings clarity. Put that on your.
That's a shirt,
right? Because it's cold. It's cold. Like it makes you focus, right? Like when you go out, like you have almost like you have to like cut through the ice with your clear. So I had eye surgery because I wanted to get northern vision. My northern vision is clear. When we come back, we're going to start talking about that Washington passing attack and what Texas is going to try to do to stop it. We'll do it next on Kings of the North. Doug Lesmerises, Bill Landis, here breaking down the Sugar Bowl between Washington and Texas. It is kind of a bummer as it worked out that Washington didn't get to play in the Rose Bowl. Doesn't that? Yeah. That's a little rough, right? It would have been fun.
It would have been fun. Yeah. I guess I'm glad that like our two northern teams were split because we can like talk about both games, but a Washington-Michigan Rose Bowl would have been sweet.
Yeah. It would have been good. But this is fine, and I'm sure Washington people are going to show up in New Orleans for this one. Washington overall, again, you can make arguments that if you want to call them the best offense in the country, like I would not argue against that, top to bottom. By the FEI ratings, that efficiency metric, Washington's offense is 6th, and Texas defensively is 7th. Again, this is a good Texas defense across the board. We're going to dig into some of the two sides of that. By EPA, right, sort of what you do play to play, Washington's offense is 8th. Texas's defense is 13th. Washington averages almost 38 points a game. Texas gives up about 17.5 points per game. So moving to throwing the ball. This is the best passing offense in the country. They throw for more yards per game than anybody. And they're just awesome. 344 yards per game is pretty darn good. And Texas has been thrown on this year, Landis. 94th in the nation in number of pass yards given up per game. 241 yards per game that Texas gives up. Michael Penix, 300-plus passing yards in 9 games this season. A lot of guys have thrown on Texas, which matters to me, right? Will Howard in Kansas State threw for 327. Josh Hoover at TCU threw for 302. Dylan Gabriel, who's going to be Oregon's quarterback next year, threw for 285 in Oklahoma's win over Texas. Jalen Milroe in that loss threw for 255. Like, they have been vulnerable to almost any quarterback with a pulse that they play. Donovan Smith at Houston, who's actually a really good quarterback, threw for 378 on them. Like, guys have been throwing on Texas all year, Bill.
Yeah, and Texas gives up big plays too. I think they've given up like 20. I think it's 21 plays of 30 yards or more, which is like toward the bottom end of the country. It's the weakness of their team, I think, is the secondary. Now they have ways to, I guess, like mask that with what they do up front. We can talk about that in a second. But yeah, that's why I love this matchup so much for Washington when I first saw it. Is I knew the teams were able to throw the ball in Texas, had done so all year, and obviously, that's what Washington does the best. And add on top of that Washington should be as complete as it's been all year with this passing attack, with the return of Jalen McMillan and Michael Penix being probably a little healthier than he was in the middle of the year.
So they don't cover great. Their slot guy is probably their best cover guy, right? Jahdae Barron is actually a pretty good slot cover guy that will match up with Jalen McMillan, but they're going to have trouble on the outside. Their two main outside corners, just coincidentally, are Ryan Watts, who's an Ohio State transfer, and Terrence Brooks, who once upon a time was an Ohio State commit and flipped. And Bill, like, they are just, I put in PFF, Power 5 cornerbacks who have played at least 20% of their team snaps this season. The coverage grades, okay, just the coverage grade. Ryan Watts was 154th and Terrence Brooks was 189th. Ryan Watts is he's missed the last couple games. He should be back for this one. He at least has the length, I think, to try to go up against Rome Odunze, but it's not that good. And I don't know how Texas is going to stop these three Washington receivers, because that is not where the strength of the team is.
It's not. And Ryan Watts too, even if he plays, he's a little overly physical at times. Like, you can probably get him into some defensive pass interference situations with the way that Washington wants to throw the ball down the field. And they add on to it too, like the way that Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer use motions. It's not dissimilar from Texas, like the way that they use motions and shifts to get guys open and to find space. It's a tough assignment for anybody. And if you're going to a game where the secondary is not your strength, then obviously it's even more challenging. And that's the situation that Texas finds itself in. So it's going to have to find ways to try to make Michael Penix uncomfortable, which even then it has been really difficult this year because Washington's offensive line is very good. And they protect him incredibly well. Like to have the rate at which Washington throws the ball, and I think they had the sixth most, or Michael Penix had the sixth most dropbacks of Power 5 quarterbacks this year, and Washington only allowed 11 sacks all year, which was tied for the fourth fewest in the country. Like, that's incredible to me. That almost doesn't make any sense. So you can have the best intentions of trying to rattle Michael Penix and force him into uncomfortable situations, but teams just haven't been able to do it. And then even when you do, he'll throw a crazy pass off of his back foot like he did a few times against Oregon. So you got to cover for a long time against Washington, and Texas just doesn't, I think, have the dudes in the secondary to do that. So as long as this game doesn't look out of the ordinary compared to what Washington has done all year in terms of its ability to protect Michael Penix, and then he should be able to find openings against his defense, no problem.
Yeah, their two starting tackles have given up 2 sacks combined all season. And so I don't think they're going to stop them. And it's just a bad matchup for Texas. Their strength is up the middle. Their strength is their run defense. But I just think Washington is going to throw all over them all day.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's going to stop it. And so then do we agree on that? Do we agree that Michael Penix is just going to throw for 375 yards and the three receivers are going to go crazy, and then Texas is going to have to try to win despite that?
Yes, I think that's the case. And it's not I don't think the importance of the return of Jalen McMillan can be overstated here, because he gives them a different element with the screen game and the short stuff that just kind of make you have to cover every inch of the field when Washington's dropping back to throw the ball, which obviously wasn't the case for the majority of the season when McMillan was dealing with that knee injury. So I would be shocked if Washington's unable to do what it wants to do throwing the ball in this game.
It's just bad luck for Texas. If Texas was playing Michigan, right? If Texas with this defensive line is playing like a run first team or a team that's trying to be physical, I think Texas is in great shape.
Yeah.
Like Texas is a team that says, okay, like we're gonna shut down your run if you're a run first team and then make you throw. But again, I can't get over they just have not played. Here's the starting quarterbacks they've played this year: JT Daniels, Jalen Milroe, Evan Swoboda, Sawyer Robertson, Jason Bean, Dylan Gabriel, Donovan Smith, Keaton Slovis, Will Howard, Josh Hoover, Rocco Becht, Baron Morton, and Alan Bowman. And they're 94th in the nation in passing yards per game given up. Like, this is not.
Right. Those are all real guys you named? Like,
yeah.
You didn't throw in a fake one.
I should have slipped one in. Baron Morton. That's the Texas.
That was the one. That was the one that made me ask.
They did stop him. He was 19 of 36 for 88 yards and 3 picks. So if they were facing Baron Morton in the playoff, they'd be great. They'd be in great shape. And Texas has given up 18 touchdown passes this year and has 16 interceptions, right? That's really good. And you'll hear people talk about Texas's 16 interceptions. That's a pretty high number. But I just read you the names.
Yeah.
What are we talking about? Like, you have the context of this, that when they faced anybody good, they've gotten toasted. And it's just funny, again, the way the sport has changed. Once upon a time, if you were in the Big 12, and I think this is a little bit still there, like, well, you're just getting thrown on all over the place because everybody's chucking it around in the Big 12. There's Patrick Mahomes and Baker Mayfield, and like, that's just what everybody's doing. And that's not what the Big 12 is right now. There's a lot more teams that play good defense, and this is not a collection of All-American quarterbacks. So we believe that Washington will throw effectively. But Washington does have to run. To what degree? When we talk about this Washington rushing game against the Texas run defense, does it just have to be complementary enough to keep Texas honest? Do they need actual balance? What do you think Washington and Dylan Johnson, their lead back, has to do?
I think it can mostly be complementary. I think you want to use it as a tool to kind of keep yourself out of routine third and longs, right? You want to have a little more third and manageables. I think it becomes really important in the red zone. Texas's red zone defense this year has been excellent. I think they're 7th in the country in red zone touchdown percentage. So you got to be able to run the ball down there to finish drives. So Washington, I think, has done that. They'll do some wildcat stuff. They'll run Michael Penix a little bit. Maybe they run him more in this game if he's healthy enough to do so. But I don't think it needs to be the thing that leads them, because frankly, if it does, they're not going to win the game. Texas's run defense is incredible. Like, T'Vondre Sweat and Byron Murphy are like maniacs at defensive tackle. Those two together, it almost feels like unfair. And that is how Texas, I'm sure, is obviously hoping to control this game, is with those two defensive tackles in the middle. And their front seven in general is quite good and quite disruptive. I think they have I think it's 10 players, maybe it's 11 players that have like double-digit pressures this year. They have a lot of guys that can get after you. I think because of all the attention that Sweat and Murphy require, just opens up a lot of things for other guys. So I don't think you lean on the run game in this game if you're Washington, because Texas has just basically shut down every rushing attack that it's faced this year, including when it played Alabama. It held Alabama to 3 yards a carry when it played them in the second game of the season. So I think it's more like situational stuff. Like, can he convert third and short? Can he convert in the red zone? Than it is like, let's line it up and prove that we're more physical than Texas and try to run the ball on them.
Yeah, statistically, what Washington does running the ball just does not match up because they throw the ball so often. So they're 100th in the nation in rushing yards per game, 125 yards per game. And then Texas is so good, they give up fewer than 100 rushing yards per game, 81. So that's the third best run defense in the country in terms of what they allow. Dylan Johnson, though, has been really good, especially end of the year. Was not as much of a factor early on. Over 1,000 yards, 14 touchdowns. And I do think it has to be complementary. Washington this year has thrown the ball 57.3% of their plays. I like a 60-40 split for them. I mean, I talk about it a lot. So, when we talk about Ohio State, I say I wish sometimes Ohio State would throw it as often as Washington throws it. But then there are times, for instance, the Arizona State game, when they didn't do anything offensively, they threw it 42 times and ran it 13 times. and they scored no offensive touchdowns in that game, right?
Yeah.
That's a problem. The second Oregon win in the Pac-12 title game, they had 41 pass attempts and 37 runs. So now we're closer to 50-50. So I don't think they need to be 50-50. To me, it's wasted plays to try to slam Dylan Johnson into this defensive line, right?
Yeah, and especially too because I look, Washington's offensive line is very good. We haven't talked about it. They won the Joe Moore Award this year for best offensive line in the country. Much of that, if not all of it, based on how well they pass protect. But like they have good tackles and their center's good. Their guards are less so, and like that's not a position you want to be in when you're playing against Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. So like line it up and let's run into the teeth of that defense. It's not a recipe for success. No.
And I don't think Kalen DeBoer is the type of coach who's going to do that. Right.
No.
They have had a month to devise when they do run the ball, how they want to do it. And it's not barrel into the two best defensive tackles in the country. But Dylan Johnson, 28 carries, 152 yards in the Pac-12 championship game. Like this is a guy who can get some stuff done. So I think they have to do it effective. They have to do it smartly. It has to be complementary. But I think if they land somewhere around 60-40 on the pass run breakdown, that's fine. They just can't land at like 85-15. Right? That we can't run at all, so we're going to completely stop. Like I think that, as you mentioned, sometimes in the middle of the year, as good as they were throwing it, they threw too much. But Dylan Johnson has emerged late, and so don't waste plays, but do enough to keep Texas off balance. And I think they can do it. Like I do think they can run enough to be effective overall as an offense. Do you think they can, or do you think this Texas defensive line can really be a problem for Washington and make them all throw?
See, well, like I thought that the second time that Washington played Oregon, that Oregon was going to like control that game up front, and that didn't happen. I think Washington owned both lines of scrimmage in that game. Texas's defensive line, I think, is probably somewhat significantly better than Oregon's. Like they don't have the same dudes, especially in the middle, that Texas has. But seeing the way that Washington played in that game does inspire a little bit of confidence, because there have been a handful of games this year with Texas where like teams just could not run the ball. Like we're averaging like a yard or fewer per carry, which is insane. Like I don't think Washington's going to find itself in that kind of territory. It's going to be tough sledding for Dylan Brooks for sure, or Dylan Johnson, excuse me, for sure. But I think they can do it well enough, and I also think they'll scheme it up a little better too, right? They've had a month to kind of figure this out and find the vulnerable points in Texas's front seven, and it's probably like on the edges, like maybe you run some more sweeps and maybe like some off tackle runs, and then you do more stuff that's in between the guards and the centers. But yeah, I think they'll find enough success. I wouldn't say they'll find a lot of it, but I think enough to be sustainable.
This is the worst offense that Texas's defense could have played, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I think it's like the nightmare scenario for Texas, like because it is a good defense, just not against Odunze, Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan, and Michael Penix. I don't.
Yeah, if Tavondre Sweat can cover Odunze, then maybe, but he can't. Yeah. Although I like to watch it. He's pretty athletic.
It is. It's like the best player on Texas's defense just might not matter that much.
It's like I do think, just like generally as like college football watchers, observers, whatever, we don't consider enough just how disruptive it is to have like two guys in the middle of your defensive line who you cannot block. And that is what Texas has. And I do think Washington's going to struggle with that some. So I think it is at least on the table that it's like Washington won because they couldn't handle those guys. But
Texas won because Washington
Texas won because Washington couldn't handle those guys. Yeah. But I do think you're like the things that Washington wants to do to win probably does match up well with a team that is built the way that Texas is on defense. Like it's not, Washington doesn't need to operate in those areas of the field to be successful.
Can we learn anything from the Ohio State-Georgia semifinal last year when you think about Jalen Carter and how disruptive he was as a defensive tackle? But that's Georgia playing a passing Ohio State offense that is able to throw the ball, and Georgia wins that game not on its defense because Stetson Bennett and the Georgia offense are good enough to get in a track meet with Ohio State and win. That, Jalen Carter was good. Jalen Carter had plays where he's eating up two guys and whatever, but it's CJ Stroud can move around in the pocket enough, and there's so many weapons that Georgia couldn't stop it. I think that is that a somewhat of a comparison potentially?
Yeah, I think so. That game required CJ Stroud to do some stuff in the backfield that he had not done all year. And Michael Penix has done a little bit of that stuff too, but I do think it kind of raises the level of execution you need in terms of being a playmaker at quarterback at times. But yes, I think that's Ohio State. If Ryan Day could have gotten away with never running the ball in that game, I think he would have done it. They really just didn't have any interest in trying to run in that game and nearly won it by virtue of its passing attack against a really stout defense. So yeah, that same plan is certainly there for Washington.
I also don't. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. I want to make sure that we say clearly with our northern eyes and northern voice that I think Rome Odunze is good enough to win this game himself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's saying a lot. He's spectacular. He's physical. He wins. He's fast. He is such a complete receiver that he's not going to be stopped, I don't think. And that as every bit as much as Marvin Harrison Jr. was last year against Georgia and it was this year for Ohio State, Rome Odunze could just, I think, go snatch this game.
I think he could. Yes, absolutely. What is your level of concern, I guess, that Texas can kind of just control what it wants to control up front with 3 or 4 guys and then play 7 or 8 in the back end the entire time and just try to put a cloud over Washington's offense?
Yeah, not that concerned because I feel if you give Penix enough time, he will find somebody.
Yeah.
And somebody will get open. And again, the assault, 11.1 average depth of target, tied for 4th in the Power 5. Every throw he makes is a first down. So that's that's just how this Washington passing offense is. They just have to go 1 for 3 to move the chains because everything they throw is down the field. And so, will Texas stop them occasionally? Yes. I don't think Texas can or will stop them consistently. And I think that's going to allow Washington to just take a shot. And okay, let Michael Penix stand back there for 5 seconds and slide, be veteran and smart and athletic enough to slide the pocket a little bit, get away from those defensive tackles, and then Rome Odunze or Jalen Polk or Jalen McMillan will find a way to get open. So I know what you're saying. I don't think that'll work.
I'm not super fearful of it either. And the thing that's hard for me is because I think that is what happened in the middle of the year when teams found some success against Washington.
Yes.
They just sort of just stayed back and said okay, try to throw it over us because we're playing as deep as we possibly can. And then, but Washington wasn't equipped to counter that, or was slow or hesitant to, or whatever, just unwilling to counter that. And I think they're in a better spot to counter that now if they counter a similar game plan from a defense. But can they actually run the ball effectively against this front to counter that? I'm not so certain of. So that's that's the one thing I'm concerned about is they put that umbrella over the passing attack. Washington tries to run the ball to counter it, but they just can't block those 2 guys in the middle, and then Washington gets bogged down one too many times.
And that did feel like that was important with the emergence of Dillon Johnson. One team started to do that. His first 100-yard rushing game was against Oregon. And then as teams started to do that, they started to lean on him a little bit more. 84 rushing yards against Stanford, 256 against USC, and 4 touchdowns. 104 against Utah, 16 for 89 against Oregon State, 21 for 82 against Washington State, and then 28 for 152 against Oregon. They had not been using him as much, but he has gone since the Oregon game was his first game with at least 20 carries. And again, that Arizona State game was so weird. He only had 8 carries in that game. But then after that, 18, 26, 23, 16, 21, 28. Like, he is a primary part of what they do. And I feel like they sort of worked that out enough. So what you're saying is everybody saw the drop 8 method against Washington. Okay, that slows down the passing game. If Texas can do that and shut down the run with the best defensive line in college football, then that's how you get Washington in trouble.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't think that's like, you hold Washington to 13 if you do that. But right. I think that's how you keep Washington from like scoring 35 or 40. Right. And then as Texas's offense equipped to just outscore them if that's the case, which I think maybe they are.
Okay. So let's get into that. When we come back, we will start talking about what's going to happen when Texas has the ball. We'll do that next on Kings of the North. All right, time now to talk about Washington defense versus Texas offense. By the FEI rankings, Texas has the 15th ranked offense in the country, which is pretty darn good. Washington's defense is 27th. EPA, what you do each play, 40th for the Texas offense, 55th for the Texas defense. Just like, how good do you think this Texas offense is, Landis?
It's hard, like good, like base level, like good, like pretty good, with a pretty high ceiling. I think if they kind of hit right on on a given day, but I think total body of work, just like solid, pretty good.
36 points per game for Texas. Washington's given up 23.6 points per game. So let's talk about the Texas passing attack specifically. Quinn Ewers missed 2 games this year, and they survived with Malik Murphy. But Ewers is the guy. How good do you think Quinn Ewers is? And I will tell you that I do think it's possible that if it gets into a shootout where Washington is scoring consistently and Texas feels like it has to keep up, and you wind up putting some pressure on Quinn Ewers, I just don't know if that's the best circumstance for Texas. Like by the end of year 2, Stetson Bennett in Georgia, like Stetson Bennett was able to rise to that challenge. And you think it's a defense first team, but when they needed to score, they could score, and he was ready for that. Do you believe that Quinn Ewers and this passing offense would be 100% ready for a shootout, or would you have doubts?
I have some doubts. Yeah, they're really good at like scheming it up early on in games, and like they sort of did that against Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship, just like really put it on them early, and it was kind of over in the first quarter. But it wasn't like, that's not what Texas has done all year as a passing offense. They're not as consistently threatening, nowhere near as consistently threatening as a Washington has been. But the pieces are there, I think, to keep pace so long as the plan is right and consistent. And Quinn Ewers can probably find a better level of consistency than what he's had this year. He's a really difficult quarterback to evaluate, and part of it is just a recruiting pedigree. It's like you expect so much of him because of how highly touted he was when he came out of school, and like there's been eyeballs on him forever. And then when you watch him play, like you definitely see a handful of throws every game. We're like, yep, I get it. I understand why people did that, but it's not like it happens every time they're out on the field, and you expect it to. With the way that people talk about him, like he's got some stuff that he does where you're just kind of like scratching your head, especially for a guy who's now played a decent amount. You're just like, you shouldn't be making those decisions or trying to make those throws at this stage in your career. So I don't know. Like I don't have a ton of trust that Quinn Ewers can like go throw for throw with Michael Penix, but I think it'd be foolish to doubt him entirely and say that like there's no way he can do it, because there's clearly a lot of talent there. He just really hasn't seemed to harness it all the right way just yet.
We sort of came to the conclusion in the Rose Bowl preview that Michigan-Alabama matchup was going to come down to Jalen Milroe and another difficult quarterback to evaluate with just absolute amazing skill, but like down to down, is he as consistent? Are we that far in this game? Does this game come down? If we are making assumptions about what Washington's going to do offensively, so that's going to require Texas to match that. Does this game come down to whether Quinn Ewers can do that? Is he that same status that Milroe is?
Yeah, I think so. It's a little different because I think that the Alabama piece feels like more about Milroe sort of individually, and I think that Quinn Ewers, like with Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell and Jordan Whittington, Jatavian Sanders. Like he has a lot of weapons around him that I think can elevate him. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case for Jalen Milroe.
Yeah.
So it's probably an easier proposition to like get behind. It's like, yeah, like Texas is going to find a way to be good enough in this game, and it's not like merely because of Quinn Ewers. But yes, I think it's about Quinn Ewers being able to elevate his game on the biggest stage he's ever played on. Because I don't have much doubt that Michael Penix is going to. And it's like if Quinn Ewers does, then Texas absolutely has a chance to win even like a shootout kind of game. I think they could do that.
Talk about the Texas passing attack. 18th in the nation, 287 passing yards per game. Again, Ewers missed 2 games this season. Malik Murphy filled in. Washington does give it up, Landis, right? 123rd in the nation, 263 passing yards per game that they allow. Ewers has thrown for at least 300 yards in 5 games. I don't want to say that the Washington defense is good. I feel like some of the raw stats for stuff like this is just based on play style and what they're willing to do. And like, they know they're going to give some of this up. I don't think they're going to get, I actually think the Washington pass defense, the guys who are part of the pass defense, and that includes Braylon Trice as an edge rusher who has more pressures than anybody in the country, I think actually might be more equipped to stop a passing attack than Texas is, right? Like, I know 263 passing yards per game is a lot, but I don't think it's just going to be easy for Texas to throw all over Washington, though. I don't know. Am I overrating Washington?
It's hard. Like you watch Washington's defense and you like a lot of the individual pieces, right? You love Jabbar Muhammad in the back end of the defense, but then like you look at some of the statistical stuff, it's like, hey, you've not been very good.
Yeah.
They're more like middle of the pack in terms of success rate on defense than they are just in like sheer yardage, which is probably a more important stat. They're better, I think, efficiency wise too than they are just in sheer amount of yards. That can be a little misleading. But they've given up big plays. They've given up the most big passing plays of any team in this playoff. Like passing plays of 30 yards or more. Washington has allowed more than Texas, Alabama, and Michigan. So that's part of the equation here. Like I don't think that it's a situation because it's not the same thing as like I think Washington is going to be able to like drop back and consistently find success against Texas's defense so long as the tackles are blowing up everything that Washington's trying to do. I don't know that Texas will be able to do that, but I think Texas is definitely going to be able to exploit some big play opportunities. So like the production might end up being similar, but the method with which they get there could be slightly different.
I do think Braylon Trice is the best edge rusher in this game, and Jabbar Muhammad's the best corner in this game, right? So I think Braylon Trice has a chance to be a real problem for Texas in this one. And I'm curious how Texas will go about it and what they'll ask of Quinn Ewers, because again, nobody chucks it down the field like Washington. Michael Penix's average depth of targets, 11.1 yards, 4th in the Power 5. Quinn Ewers is 8.1 yards. That's 40th in the Power 5. Big time throw percentage, which again, a big time throw is, you know it when you see it. Michael Penix averages, makes a big time throw 6.7% of the time. That's 8th in the Power 5. Quinn Ewers 3.5% of the time. That's 39th in the Power 5. And then their turnover worthy plays are about equal. Quinn Ewers has a turnover worthy play 1.9% of the time. Penix is 1.5. So like Penix is more explosive, but he doesn't turn it over more than Ewers does. And then you talked about what Washington gives up in the pass game. Texas has 26 pass plays of 20 yards or more this year. That's only 35th in the country, whereas Washington has 71. That's 2nd in the country. So I do think, though, right, it's going to be Steve Sarkisian dialing it up.
Yes.
A variety of playmakers, and that it's more Quinn Ewers point guard than Quinn Ewers go make every play by yourself. What do you think of those playmakers led by Xavier Worthy that Washington's going to have to deal with?
They're really good. Like I think Xavier Worthy might be the second best receiver in this game. Like I think it's worth a conversation. AD Mitchell, like the transfer from Georgia, has been better at Texas than he was at Georgia.
Yeah.
But he also had a knack at Georgia for like stepping up in games like this. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind as well. Jatavian Sanders, a tight end, is the one for me that I could see Washington having some trouble with. He's just like a unique matchup, and I'm guessing that Washington will probably try to cover him with a safety. Jordan Whittington too is like a more physical kind of slot guy that I think can be difficult to deal with. So I like the passing weapons a lot, and Texas's offensive line is good, so they're going to give Quinn Ewers, I think, time to throw. And the other, like, sometimes we like overstate the importance or impact of like offensive coordinators and coaches and stuff like this. Like, Sark is a weapon, so I think that's part of this equation too. It's not merely the pieces; it's the guy who's kind of like putting them in places to succeed. And I actually think, like, you look at Quinn Ewers' big time throw rate, and it's like kind of low in a way that's almost concerning. Part of that is probably because Sark is so good at scheming guys wide open, and he doesn't have to make big time throws. So they're going to be able to find openings against Washington's defense. I don't have much doubt about that. If it ends up that like Braylon Trice and maybe like ZTF can get after Quinn Ewers a little bit, I think I'd be surprised by that all, because Texas's offensive line has been so good this year. Like, Kelvin Banks, their left tackle, is one of the best tackles in the country. So I just don't think it's going to be a day where those guys up front for Washington are going to like pin their ears back and get after Quinn Ewers. So the combination of skill and Sark and it not having to be on Quinn Ewers' shoulders so much, I think leads to a fairly explosive day for what Texas's passing attack too.
Are you leaning high scoring here?
Yeah.
Generally speaking.
I think I'm thinking probably both teams in the 40s. Yeah.
In the 40s. Okay.
Yeah.
I think let me see what the over under is for this game. It's 63.5. Ooh, so you're in the 80s. Oh.
Yeah.
That's a Landis special.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Texas running the ball, and we'll do that next on Kings of the. All right. Time to talk about the Texas rushing attack. And of all the things that have changed this season, Landis, this is the biggest change. Jonathan Brooks was an 1,100-yard rusher in 10 games for Texas. He ran for at least 98 yards in his last 8 games of the year, but he's been out. He tore his ACL, and since he's been out the last 3 games, it's been much more by committee. I think you could argue, was he their best offensive player, and Texas doesn't have him. So when we think about this rushing attack, we'll run through the stats here quickly. Texas, 189 rushing yards per game. That's 24th in the country. Washington gives up 134 rushing yards per game. That's the 40th statistical run defense in the country. CJ Baxter kind of like leading the committee, 595 yards on the season. How much does it change the equation and the evaluation of this game that Jonathan Brooks is not part of it?
Yeah, a little bit. Like, Texas still wants to run the ball, and I think it's run the ball okay. They're not always the most efficient rushing offense, but they've managed to still accumulate a fair amount of yards. I think they lose like explosiveness, like ability to just kind of get 10+ yard runs without Jonathan Brooks. It's actually it's funny. He's, like you said, he only played 10 games. He's still like, I think he's 11th in the country still in yards after contact, and he's like top 10 still in missed tackles force, even though he hasn't played for. He didn't play the last 3 games for Texas. So it's a big piece of their offense that they're missing. Like, Sark will still want to run the ball. I like CJ Baxter is just hasn't been as productive, I think, or as reliable, but like, he's a pretty good back, and they can throw the ball to him out of the backfield a little bit. So if Brooks were available, one, I think like he would have been like Texas's Heisman Trophy candidate and probably had a pretty compelling case. And 2, would have provided like a balance to this offense that would just make it much more threatening maybe than it currently is. But Texas is still a physical team with a good offensive line and good enough running backs that I think you still have to worry about the rushing attack.
Do you think they can run over Washington with the offensive line? Like, do you think that they can control the game on the ground because of what they have up front?
I think they could. Some teams have run the ball on Washington a little bit this year. Like, Oregon definitely did the first game, less so the second game, although it had a good yards per carry average in that game. USC ran it well against Washington. Washington has given up some stuff in the run game, and it's just like the thing that worries you, I guess, is not so much like, you know, a team like running you to death and putting up a bunch of points that way, but just like running it well enough to kind of keep away from you if you're Washington.
Yeah.
You want the ball as much as you possibly can have it if you're Washington, because you feel confident in your ability to score every time you have it. And I do think Texas's offensive line and stable of backs, and they'll get like receivers and tight ends and stuff involved too. Like, they're pretty creative running the ball. I think they're good enough to play that way if Washington's defense is like not up to the challenge of matching the physicality of Texas in the trenches.
All right, nobody's here to listen to us talk about running attacks. All right, let's talk about the two bosses in this game.
Okay,
Kalen DeBoer and Steve Sarkisian. They are both 49 years of age, and we're going to do a little bit of This Is Your Life. In the year 2009, Kalen DeBoer was in his final season as the head coach at the University of Sioux Falls. He was on his way to a 15-0 season, rampaging through the Great Plains Athletic Conference and winning his third NAIA national championship in 5 years. He just dominated the NAIA football level. So 2009 was his last year, and he was so good. He was the dominant force at that level. He was so good, he got the offensive coordinator job at Southern Illinois. That's what being the best head coach in NAIA football gets you. So at 35 years of age, he was winning his third national title. That same year in 2009, at 35 years of age, Steve Sarkisian was in his first year of the job that Kalen DeBoer now has. That it took Kalen DeBoer to age 48 to get. Steve Sarkisian was coaching the Washington Huskies. He had been the offensive coordinator for Pete Carroll at USC, got the Washington job, was not there very long, went to USC, and then flamed out at USC and began this cycle of going through the Nick Saban car wash at Alabama, getting his career back on track, and getting the Texas job. But it just strikes me, Landis, that these guys are the exact same age, but Sarkisian was 15 years ahead in his career of Kalen DeBoer, but he skidded off the road, and now he's back on track, and now they're at the same place. They're in the college football playoff going head-to-head against each other. But there's another world where Steve Sarkisian is in year 13 or whatever at Washington, running this dominant program that's about to go into the Big Ten, but it didn't work out that way.
You almost forget that Steve Sarkisian was at Washington, right? Like, because you just think of the USC and the way it ended there. But you know why you don't forget about Steve Sarkisian at Washington? Because he offered and got a commitment from an 8th grade Tate Martell when he was the head coach at Washington.
Oh, wow. Was that the beginning of the end for Steve Sarkisian?
They did sync up there. Yeah, so maybe. No, it is interesting. I actually didn't realize that they were more or less the same age. But it's interesting to me, like what keeps a coach from Steve Sarkisian just basically became a Power 5 coach immediately. And I don't know, or an FBS coach, I guess I should say, immediately. And what keeps a guy like Kalen DeBoer from doing that? It's a little odd. And there's certainly a world where I don't know. There's probably been other guys with the coaching acumen of Kalen DeBoer who maybe never got out of that lower level because they just maybe didn't want to go be the offensive coordinator at Southern Illinois to put themselves on that track. So it's just kind of odd to me how coaches find their way to the positions that they get into. But
I think everyone knew when Sark went to Washington that he was just treading water until he could get back to USC. He was Lincoln Riley before Lincoln Riley.
Yeah.
Like a coach in his 30s, offensive acumen. When he went to USC the first time around, it was like, all right, here you go. This is going to continue the Pete Carroll style of dominance. And it just did not happen at all. So it's a great testament to Kalen DeBoer that he worked his way up from the NAIA level. He played at the University of Sioux Falls, which is how he won. He was the offensive coordinator there and then took over as the head coach there. Went 67-3 in 5 years there. And so that for him to work his way all the way up to Washington, he was great at Fresno State, got the Washington job, is a great hire. And it's a great testament to Steve Sarkisian that it got away from him. He had some, I think, off-field issues. And here he is. He's back 25-13 at Texas. Kalen DeBoer, this is year 3 for Sark at Texas. 24-2, Kalen DeBoer in year 2 at Washington. It's just I love the coaching matchup, and I do think that they're both going to bring something to the table. You talked that Steve Sarkisian is a weapon in and of himself, but I think you've watched Washington the whole year, and Kalen DeBoer is the head coach and Ryan Grubb is the offensive coordinator. They let it all hang out, man. And they are not afraid to call something on fourth down. They are not afraid to find interesting ways to get the ball into the hands of their best playmakers. And I absolutely not only think it could happen, I think we should anticipate, right? The idea that both Washington and Texas are going to have a couple play calls offensively in this game that lead to huge plays, that feel creative, that feel bold in the moment, because that's kind of what these guys do.
Yeah, and it's also, I just think it's the time when like offensive minds like this tend to shine, or you just have so much time to figure out your game plan. And it's not to say defensive coordinators can do the same thing, but they also coach defense, and football is set up more for offenses to be successful, unfortunately for them. So this is a perfect storm, I think, to see the best of two of the more creative offensive staffs, I think, in college football. It's interesting, the dynamic where like it's like Steve Sarkisian as the head coach is like kind of the guy who's doing it himself, and Kalen DeBoer, who was obviously a very successful offensive coordinator before he became a head coach, has sort of like passed that to Ryan Grubb, who's become one of the hotter names as an offensive mind. But there's two different methods of going about it, but the results are, I think, going to be like really dynamic, explosive offensive game plans, which is why I feel so confident that this game's going to be high scoring.
All right, so let's get to our picks then. Landis keeps teasing us, confident that the game is going to be high scoring. Again, Washington is a 4-point underdog in this game. The over-under is 63.5. So that is pretty darn high scoring. Bill Landis, we'll start with you. What is your pick for the Sugar Bowl?
I think it's going to be like an all-time classic back and forth shootout. I have Washington winning 49-42. Oftentimes, I think these semifinal games have not lived up to the billing in the 4-team playoff. There's been just a lot of clunkers in there. We saw an excellent one last year with Georgia and Ohio State coming down to the last second when Ohio State missed a field goal and Georgia won by a point. I can see this game playing out very similarly, just like both offenses kind of doing whatever they want to do, scoring more often than not. Like, maybe you see a defensive splash play that could be like the difference, because I do think there's enough talent on both sides or both of these defenses for like a guy to make a play to step up and like either steal a possession or maybe score themselves to ultimately to sway it. But I just think it's Michael Penix and these receivers at their peak, with Ryan Grubb at his peak and Sark at his peak, and probably the best of Quinn Ewers that we've seen, and Texas's playmakers doing their thing. And it's just like an offensive showcase that Washington wins.
So I just was grabbing the historical scores in the college football playoff because I was like, oh, wow, 49. Is that one of the higher scoring totals? And the playoff has been out of control since it started.
Yeah.
Let me run through. Oregon scored 59 in the very first semifinal ever played, beating Florida State 59-20 in the Rose Bowl in the first college football playoff. Let's see some other huge scores. Georgia, well, that was a double overtime game. Georgia beat Oklahoma 54-48 in a semifinal. Alabama scored 45 on Oklahoma in a semifinal. Maybe if it's against Oklahoma, it shouldn't count because everybody scores against Oklahoma. Clemson scored 44 to beat Alabama in the national title game. LSU against Oklahoma dropped 63 in a semifinal. Ohio State scored 49 in a semifinal against Clemson. Then Alabama beat Ohio State in that national title game 52-24. And then last year, 51-45 TCU over Michigan, 42-41 Georgia over Ohio State, and Georgia dropped 65 on TCU in the national title game. So you're right on track, brother.
Yeah.
They
fireworks, baby.
They set the total on this too low. Now I feel stupid with my pick, 49-42. I think you're going to have a noser. I think you're exactly right on this. I am also going to take Washington, and now I feel silly for only saying 38-27. I don't expect Texas to keep up in a shootout as much. And so I think Washington, for the most part, does what it wants to do. I can see Washington getting out to a lead and then maybe pulling it back a little bit and running the ball slightly. And Texas maybe just having a little more trouble, maybe a couple turnovers, go for it on fourth down in some situations, right? Where maybe even Texas is moving the ball, but on key plays is falling just short and it's not translating into points. But I'm still over too. So like, again, this is not a betting show, but man, 63.5, like this feels like free money.
It feels very low. Like I don't really understand it. It's a lot of faith, I guess, in Texas's defense, but
Yeah.
Yeah,
as we've proven on the show, misplaced faith.
Yeah,
I think this Washington passing attack.
Yeah, it feels like a comfortable over to me, but what do I know?
Okay, so we're in agreement on this. We're both picking the Northern team, Washington, to beat Texas. You'll have to go watch the Alabama-Michigan Rose Bowl preview to find out what our picks were there. But it would be a heck of a thing, Bill, to have at least one Northern team in the national championship game, because we have not had a Northern national champion outside of Ohio State since Michigan in 1997. I think that's right. So, and even since then, it's not, Ohio State in 2002 and Ohio State in 2014, it's not been that many. So this is an opportunity. We talked about that we think Washington should not be the big underdog of these four teams. And we both certainly think Michigan has a chance. And if we get Washington, Michigan, that they're going to be Big Ten brethren next year, and they wind up in the national title game, like, the North will have taken over. The North, we made it. We will have made, we thought it into existence. We made it happen. But even if you get at least one of them, this is just where the sport is going, North versus South. I think it's good that we got two semifinals that are this way. And I do think it's good, with what Michigan has done lately and what Michigan has done historically. Certainly Michigan's a traditional power, a blue blood. They had a little lull there, and Bama's Bama. So I also like the idea that you get sort of an established semifinal with Bama, Michigan, and then you get this sort of new guy semifinal with, again, Texas historically has been there, but not at all recently. And that Washington is back on the scene here. I think a Texas-Washington semifinal, I don't think it'll be a dud. I think these two teams, as much as I've been a little cautious with Texas, I'm not cautious. I ripped Texas at various times during this show. I still think they are a worthy semifinal team, and we haven't always had that. So I think this was a worthy season that produced four worthy teams, and I think we're going to get two good games.
Do you think if it ends up being Washington, Michigan, they can just move the title game to Pasadena?
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say Indy, but yeah, no, that'd be great.
Indy would be fine.
I'm sure the Rose Bowl would. I don't even know. The Rose Bowl might step in and say they're not allowed to play anywhere, but they might file an injunction. Wouldn't the Rose Bowl do that? Like they would sue the city of Houston and be like, "You're not allowed to have our game in your city."
They should. I'd be in favor of it. Yeah.
Yeah. The sun doesn't set in Houston, so we have to play it in Pasadena. Okay. So we appreciate everybody joining us here for our two semifinal previews. If you care about Ohio State football, we will have a post-game show on our Kings of Columbus show, which is part of our The Podcast YouTube channel. You're finding, of course, Kings of the North here on the own Kings of the North YouTube and podcast channel. And then we're going to come back. We're going to have reaction. This is the plan, Bill, right? We're going to have live reaction after the Rose Bowl, right? Like right when it ends. Maybe even we'll start before it ends if the game is in hand. And then we will late night after the Sugar Bowl have live reaction to that. So on New Year's Day, expect two roughly half-hour live shows on this Kings of the North YouTube channel coming to you live, where we'll talk about what happened in those games.
Yep, we'll do that, and then probably regroup and do something a little more in depth the next day, or maybe a day or two after. But we wanted to have that like raw live reaction from both games, and we didn't. It felt a little weird to like wait 6 hours to give it to you on the Rose Bowl. So we're gonna try to squeeze one in between the two games on that one, and then again after the Sugar Bowl late night.
Sounds good. All right, for now, thanks to you guys for making Kings of the North part of your college football fandom. Want to say thanks as always to our producer, Mike Yorostowski. He's Bill Landis. I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was the Kings of the North.